Hello, welcome to another Black Horizons program. I'm your host, Hamid Rasheed. We're glad that you could take time out to join us. In today's program, we'll be talking about multicultural education. In recent years, there's been much emphasis on the development of multicultural programs in education. On Tuesday, July 13th of this year, Dr. Dorothy Porter, director of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, delivered a presentation on multiculturalism and human rights in education. In today's program, we will talk to Dr. Porter about the need for and the value of implementation of multicultural education programming. Dorothy, we want to extend a warm welcome to you and a warm thanks for appearing on our Black Horizons program, particularly given the fact that in the last day or so you've had some difficulties with your voice. We want to welcome you to our program and at the same time thank you for coming along to join us.
Thank you for inviting me.
I wonder if we could ask you to start off the program, if I could ask you how you would define multicultural education or educational equity.
Multicultural education may be defined as a concept which has as its goal the education of youth with the purpose of developing self-actualized citizens who have respect for the dignity of all people. Along with that, there is an affirmation of the existence of differences among peoples, differences in race, differences based on ethnic origin, sex differences, differences as it relates to physical abilities or disabilities, and economic differences. But in spite of all of those, there are talents and potential that all of these individuals can contribute toward building a better society.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, how would you define the need for multicultural programs, and who benefits by their implementation?
There is an existing need, obviously in the States as well as in Canada. From what I know about Canada, there has not historically been an accurate and comprehensive inclusion or account of the role of minorities in the development of the various countries. There has not been a recognition and an acknowledgement of the talents and the potential of various peoples. And as a result of that, then I think the communities have lost out on a lot that could have been offered. For minorities themselves, there has been a lessening of the self-esteem and self-respect and self-confidence that's needed to make a significant contribution to society. So there is a need in terms of accurately portraying and introducing, presenting what exists within a given society. Also, by including educational equity as a major or priority goal of an educational system, there is a benefit to the larger community in that these individuals then are more likely to become productive citizens who can make a significant contribution which benefits everyone, not just the minority group that individual may represent. The other thing that should be mentioned is that inevitably individuals who are not self-sufficient and independent economically and otherwise become dependent upon the state or upon others, depending on the governmental system, political system of a given country. But the more education can be used as a tool to build productive citizens, the better it is for everyone involved.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, in your view, what would you say are the main elements that a multicultural education program or plan should include?
In terms of developing, a comprehensive plan, I think that the practical way to approach it in light of limited resources, which is often used as an excuse not to seriously commit to equal educational opportunity, providing that for all students, is to conduct a needs assessment. That should be a priority. That should be a beginning point after a policy or philosophy statement has been established. And I think it's significant to establish a philosophy or policy which is articulated and documented and publicly affirmed. Of course, an effective multicultural education program has to go beyond just a philosophy statement.
Yes.
But I think it's important to, for the powers that be, for those who control both fiscal and human resources, those who impact policy decisions, to make a public commitment to educational equity. And that's symbolized in having or in the statement of a philosophy or the policy statement. Then moving from there to a needs assessment. There is diversity, and we recognize that there's diversity among staff and others in an educational setting. So all people are not going to be at the same point
Yes.
in terms of awareness or commitment or knowledge and skills. So there needs to be an assessment in terms of where educators are in that regard. And there also needs to be an assessment of the existing curriculum, what has been, what is, in terms of trying to determine where or how to get to a goal that has been established as it relates to, or the more specific goals as it relates to educational equity. Following that, there has to be an appropriation of funds. Budget is the bottom line. All of those other things without the budget are counterproductive.
Yes.
And so budget is essential to the implementation of a plan. That is to have any kind of measurable outcome. And so those who control the resources must commit to provide adequate resources. And that has to be money, but it can also be other resources, making available staff release time as an example of the kind of resources that would be necessary. A third very important element is involvement of the community. Historically, communities of minority students
Yes.
have not been involved for one reason or another. Sometimes that's through no fault of the school system, but out of necessity, many minority parents work during the day, which has traditionally been the time that the PTAs and other
Yes.
types of groups have become active in school functions. But for a plan to be effective or to develop a legitimate and valid plan, there has to be input by the communities that have not traditionally been involved in the school system, and that would be the minority community, parents and non-parents if they are part of the community, but they are minority parents or parents who have not been involved in the past. And then following that, another very important element is the development of a plan an evaluation plan or program. And I guess I probably would call it a program rather than a plan. But it has to identify specific strategies and mechanisms for measuring and determining to what extent or degree the specific goals of the program have or have not been accomplished. That does a couple of things. It's a way to require accountability in terms of the use of funds. It's a way to measure the achievement of goals of an equal education opportunity program. And certainly it helps to identify a starting point for subsequent plans and goals for future school years. So I think that's extremely important. And as far as I'm concerned, those who are committed to equity in education would not develop a plan without having a good evaluation program, because what really counts is outcome.
That's
The
right.
rhetoric, the philosophy, all of the other things are not significant unless there are some identifiable outcomes.
Right. I guess it could be inferred, too, from the remarks you've just made about the importance of evaluation, that when we look at a multicultural program, that it's not a static kind of thing, that it can change over time as circumstances change.
That's correct. The dynamics are infinite and will vary with the country, with the region, the province, or with the individual school district or system. Obviously, the plan for the first year of a comprehensive equal educational opportunity plan will change if that plan is successful to any extent the
Yes.
first year.
Yes.
So the dynamics include not only the people who are involved, but a number of other variables, one of which then would be the outcomes of the first phase or the first part of a plan. So that's correct. And to avoid it being merely an academic exercise, that's the purpose and function of the needs assessment. So that should be conducted annually or periodically to determine where we are or where you are in the implementation of the plan, and to adjust and modify then the plan to accommodate the current needs, which may change from time to time. And getting into a program may reveal information that may not be available initially, which should dictate where one goes from that point in terms of educational equity.
Mm-hmm. Going back and looking at one of the elements of the plan is the needs assessment program. I guess this perhaps would be a very, very crucial element, because without that database, without that sort of overview in terms of where the number of students, where they are performing, what their situation, and so on, your plan, of course, wouldn't have any relevance to the situation.
That's true. Goals can't be set without having some data initially. Realistic goals, defendable goals, credible goals. And, excuse me, because educational equity is not necessarily a concept that is wholeheartedly endorsed by everyone who must be involved, by all of the people who impact a student's learning experience, I think goals have to have a great deal of credibility. And the only way to ensure that is to have a scientific and objective database on which to establish the goals and objectives that are to be accomplished. So there are a number of ways of collecting, through surveys, through interviews, through researching what has existed, through analyzing and reviewing curriculum materials, as well as activities that accommodate various goals that are perhaps district level or departmental, before determining how to proceed.
Right. Well, I know there's been, in fact, I want to talk perhaps a little later, if time permits, to you about a specific experience that I know that you were involved in, which was quite successful. But I guess it would be quite important to any district or board, any jurisdiction that was contemplating involving a plan, to look at what has gone on, look at some of the models. I know in the United States, for example, you've had a lot of experience with this kind of thing. And I suppose that would be a very, very important element of
You're correct. There's no point in recreating the wheel.
Yes.
Excuse me. And while we have not arrived in the States by any means in this area, we have been highly involved in educational equity for the past 20 years. And so in looking at the fact that there are limited resources, I think it would be very important to do some research to determine what has been used in other places, comparable school settings. And that information then may be modified and adapted to fit the needs of this community, as an example, to avoid unnecessary duplication. And also, in terms of models, I think it's important to benefit from or profit from the mistakes of others.
Yes.
And the models that currently exist and are available have generally been evaluated and reevaluated and assessed and modified to accommodate for the errors or the weaknesses, the inadequacies that existed. And I think that this would save a lot of time and money and energy and effort. It also clearly establishes at the outset who the key players are in this whole effort of educational equity. And I think it will be clear that that is not just educators, not just students, or not just a faction of the education community, but the larger community.
In terms of the actors, if I could cut it from it, how important is it to have the students, the consumers, the direct consumers of the product involved in this kind of planning?
I think that varies with obviously the age level of students.
Yes.
There are a number of student groups and student organizations within the communities as well as within the schools that are able to, based on their knowledge, their awareness of educational needs and the process of education, as well as their maturity, which is not always connected directly with chronological age,
Yes.
who will be able to make significant contributions in identifying what they perceive as their needs. I think another very important resource is the business community. Mm-hmm. Other communities for whom we are preparing students in terms of equipping them with marketable skills, and not only marketable skills, but in terms of what the overall needs of society are deemed to be, involving those people to help identify what goals should be established as they perceive them based on their interaction with students who have graduated from the various institutions of learning. They are often able to help us identify what they perceive as weaknesses in what has been provided in the way of training of youth. So, yes, there is a place for students. There's a place for the business community. I believe there's a place for the larger community, as well as what we typically consider the people who determine what happens, and that is usually educators and sometimes parents.
Right. Well, now, while we're talking about the involvement of the business community, we're particularly here in Canada now, we're in a situation where we're undergoing tremendous restraint, government cutbacks, lacks of funding, and so on. Given that the business community benefits when you have people who are given skills, marketable skills, skills that can be used by that community, would it be, in your opinion, is it fair to suggest that the business community might have some direct responsibility in terms of making funding available for this kind of thing?
I definitely think so. In the States, in Colorado, for example, there is an internship program which is sponsored by the business community, which allows students to receive on-the-job training, and that is totally supported in terms of funding by the business community. Mm-hmm. That teaches students a number of things, responsibility, for example. Excuse me, it introduces them to the realities of the work world. And it does provide some supportive funding for an expansion of the educational experience. And that, in this case, is provided by the business community. It also gives the business community an opportunity to have direct input into the educational curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to talk to you. We have about 9 or 10 minutes remaining on today's program, so we're getting out of time. This is a very interesting topic. But I'd like to just have you comment on the objectives of some suggestions you could make in terms of appropriate objectives for multicultural programs.
Well, the objectives to some degree will be determined by the needs assessment, but they should focus on a number of areas. Obviously, there should be objectives, goals and objectives for students in terms of learning.
Yes.
What is it? What are the desired outcomes for students? An example might be looking at the 3 areas of learning. In terms of cognitive learning, what kinds of facts and information should students receive, pardon me, about the society in which they live,
yes,
which should reflect then all groups, all individuals, and the contributions, the history, the culture of those groups. What knowledge then should be included? That would determine a set of goals for students. Secondly, in the affective realm, which has to do with attitudes and feelings, how would we like students to feel about people who are different?
yes,
What are the desirable attitudes that students should leave an institution of learning holding as it relates to people of different racial, ethnic backgrounds,
mm-hmm,
and that kind of thing? that will constitute another set of learning goals and objectives for students. And then finally, in terms of behavioral outcomes or behavioral goals, which I think is critical again because that's our measurement of how successful we've been.
Yeah.
What are the behaviors? What are the actions that will demonstrate the desired outcomes? How will students behave, in other words, if educational equity has been implemented? So there will be 3 sets of student goals, or goals for students, and that should be integrated throughout the curriculum regardless of the subject area. And it's not just relegated to content areas. Student goals should be established, for example, by departments of student services. Here, I don't know if you have counselors,
Yes.
psychologists, for example, and others who are responsible for providing other types of services to students outside the academic or strictly academic realm. There should be goals then for other student services that are provided, which will be sensitive to and adjust for the differences that exist, economic differences,
Yes.
social, cultural differences, linguistic differences, and so forth, of the students who are served by a school. So there's a whole set of goals for students. And these are not, I'm not telling you these necessarily in terms of priority.
Yes.
There must be goals for everyone else who's involved with the education of youth. That would include in the states, it would be in public schools, the Board of Education,
Yes.
a policy position, the adoption of an educational equity plan for a system. And with that would be a commitment of funding. There would be goals for the superintendent and the superintendent's cabinet. There would be goals for building principals, for department heads or team leaders, for classroom teachers. And those would vary, obviously, depending on the key role and responsibility of those individuals. In-service training is an example of an objective, which is critical. Very few teachers, very few educators, very few board members come to an educational setting with the level of sensitivity and awareness that are necessary to develop and implement an educational equity plan. So in-service is critical, and that should be a major goal or objective, so that people know what they're supposed to be doing, and so that attitudes may be influenced in a positive way, and that should impact then the behaviors, which are critical and essential to the implementation of educational equity.
So I think it's very important from what you're saying as well, given that many teachers come into the system without the skills that are necessary for successful implementation of these kinds of programs. That suggests that there should be more emphasis placed in the teacher training institutions on the kinds of skills that are required.
Absolutely. And that's an area in the states, pardon me, that we have still not adequately dealt with. If we could convince the institutions of higher education that, particularly those that train teachers, there is an important need and there is a difference because they have not caught up with, in many instances, the public schools in terms of training. There is a need to prepare teachers in terms of methods of teaching, instructions and methodology, as well as a simple, basic underlying awareness of differences among cultures, among races, among sexes, so that then that can be applied and reflected not only in the materials that are used, but in teaching methods. Individualized training or teaching, for example, should show some consideration for individual differences of students. And just in terms of attitudes as they are conveyed both verbally and non-verbally during an educator's interaction with students, with parents of students, are the kinds of things that institutions of higher education need to give more attention to. How to incorporate, for example, into a music curriculum or an art curriculum. Multiculturalism for some people is overwhelming, and they're appalled that we would even suggest that that's possible or that it's educationally valid. And it is, and it's very simple. But those things should be introduced at the college level rather than having to provide that initial elementary type of information to teachers after some of them have been teaching for 20 years. And then they're being told that they have to reassess and adjust their methods of teaching as well as the types of material and information that they're imparting.
Right. I wonder if I could get you to comment briefly on the objectives as they relate to the community, particularly parents. What kind of involvement and what kind of things are appropriate for parents, for example, in these kinds of programs?
You know, we're not suggesting that the lay community has the expertise that the education community does. We're not underestimating the intelligence, the knowledge, the skills that educators have, and therefore what they can contribute. We're not suggesting that the community, the lay community, parents and others, have more knowledge, more information, more expertise as it pertains to how to go about educating youth. But I do believe that there is an important and untapped resource there that can be used to help identify what the lay community perceives as needs. After all, it is their children who are being educated. And so they should, I think, and do have a right to help and to provide some input into the determination of and the development of the goals of an educational setting or system. And so parents can help to pinpoint what they perceive to be the needs as it relates to multiculturalism, whether it has to do with establishing the types of materials that may be used as an advisory group, not as a dictatorship, not as a group that will absolutely impose and control and determine what is best, but rather a group that can advise what may be important in the way of materials, in the way of activities, as well as methods of presenting those materials.
We just have a few seconds left, Dorothy. I'd like you in the closing seconds to ask you, what do you think will be the outcome or the impact if we don't move towards implementing these kinds of programs?
Well, I briefly alluded to that at the opening of the program. And without dramatizing or over-dramatizing the fact, and it is a very serious point, I think we will see the perpetuation of all of the negatives in society. People who are dependent, people who are frustrated and bitter and angry, who often become violent, who often become the periphery or operate and live on the periphery of society. Feeling no ownership, then they feel no risk are being taken when they lash out and do things that are destructive, unfortunately, not only to the larger society, but most pathetically to themselves. And so we have all kinds of costs and losses. We have financial costs and losses in terms of dollars and cents with the destruction of property. We have lost in terms of human resources. These are people who may have the potential to become the lawyers, the doctors, the educators, the human rights workers, the social workers, the street cleaners, the nurses, the doctors, and so forth. And we lose out on those resources. And beyond that, I think we have a problem with the promotion of...
I got to cut you off, dear. We've
Yes.
just run out of time. I want to thank you once again for being our guest.
Thank
you
you.
for watching our program today. Join us next week, won't you? Hello, welcome to another Black Horizons program. I'm your host, Hamid Rasheed. We want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for another Black Horizons program. In today's program, we'll be talking about human rights. Earlier this week, approximately 250 participants from Europe, the United States, and Canada gathered in Halifax for the 34th Annual Conference of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies. The gathering, perhaps, is the largest gathering of human rights officials that has been held in Canada in recent times. In today's program, we will talk to Arthur Green, who is the director of the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Atlantic Region representative of IORA. Art, we want to welcome you to the Black Horizons program.
Thanks so very much for having us.
I wonder if perhaps I could ask you to explain for us when and why IORA, or the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, and that's a mouthful.
Yes, it is.
When and why it was formed.
Well, it was a big need we were trying to meet. 1949, it was the beginning of a period in American and Canadian history when we saw a need for our governments, our state, federal, and local governments to address in a very systematic, orderly, legal way the questions of discrimination. And the Northeast, particularly in the U.S., there began to form a number of state commissions on human rights or civil rights and human relations, and they began to meet annually. Perhaps Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey met initially. The commissioners met to discuss and exchange ideas. They were concerned about not duplicating the effort and learning from each other, and that really formed the nucleus, and that remains to today the central proposition that IORA is dedicated to, and that is to provide a forum for human rights agencies around the world, theoretically, to talk with each other and exchange information and to learn and to grow. So it's a professional growth for our governments.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, it's the International Association, and I guess from what you've been saying, that it had its beginning primarily in North America.
Right.
To what extent have you succeeded in getting representation from other official human rights agencies around the globe? What percentage of, in your opinion, of the official human rights agencies are represented in the IORA membership?
Well, the membership is largely U.S., United States. The organizations I indicated formed in 49 out of the northeast section of the U.S., and we eventually cover most of the state and local commissions in our country in the U.S. Ontario, the province of Ontario, and Toronto, we did have the beginning of our corporation. We are incorporated now, and we've included now most of the Canadian province commissions.
Yes. And
we've made efforts over the years to bring into membership some of the Caribbean agencies. There are some there, not very strong or active, but they're there nonetheless, and we've tried to involve them, such as I understand from Dr. Hill. Bermuda is, again, attempting to develop a commission, and we've related over the years to the English effort in race relations. So
yes.
The effort has been largely a U.S.-Canadian one.
I see. Well, now, could you tell us something about how IORA is structured? Does it, for example, have a full-time staff, an office?
One of the unique things about this organization, as opposed to, say, the private civil rights efforts in our countries,
yes,
is that we represent our governments. We
yes.
are really government officials,
yes.
Addressing the problems of discrimination and inequity through the government position or the government position, and we are therefore talking not about how one relates to discrimination in a voluntary way, but how one enforces the law.
Yes.
That gives us that uniqueness, and that we don't have a staff, but we represent our agencies, and our agencies contribute to organizations such as ours by membership dues.
Yes.
Now, the membership dues is never adequate, of course, to provide a staff because we aren't paying a great deal per agency. The office that IORA has is located in Washington, D.C. So
yes.
really one room with a telephone, and persons such as myself on the board, we volunteer our time. We occasionally are able to pick up a contract with our federal government for training purposes, and that gives us some administrative resource or some administrative capability, but we do not have a staff. We do have a contract presently with one of our federal agencies, which gives us some way of relating to the organization.
Right. I guess that given that you are agencies that have come together that have formed the association, you can call upon the staff of a number of these agencies when there are tasks and things that have to be done. So that really limits the need for having a separate paid professional staff, I suppose, as well.
Well, I wouldn't quite agree to the latter, but
No.
certainly the former is true. As
Yes.
we do call upon our respective agency staff to make contributions, such as, in my case, I have several responsibilities in the organization, and then I utilize my staff back in Connecticut to
Yes.
assist me in carrying out my volunteer responsibilities. And each agency, particularly those of us on the board,
Yes.
contributes that way. But we still need a staff, you see. We need
Yes.
a paid full-time staff, because with a paid full-time staff, the organization could do much more. We wouldn't rely upon the circumstances of our governments, our local governments or state agencies. We would be able to develop training programs on a much more consistent basis. We would be able to develop fundraising capability, which we desperately need. We would be able to address the issues of our concerns with our governments, our federal government. And that's one of my roles as a member of the board, is to be the federal liaison with our federal U.S. government. And that's a tremendously important job and very difficult job as a volunteer. So we do need a full-time staff, even though we do lend some of our own staff resources to the job, such as
Right.
Dr. McCurdy does here.
Yes.
His staff has just done marvelous things with this convention here.
Right. Well, I want to talk to you in a minute about your action plan for 82-83. I can
Sure.
see the level of your involvement, because I see you figure in here in a number of capacities, fundraiser, and so on. But for the time being, I wonder if I could just ask you perhaps to explain a little bit about the range of services. I was quite impressed in examining some of the literature on IORA, of the range of services that you provide to the membership of IORA.
The services are related somewhat to the structure of the organization. The organization is structured first through a board of directors that's elected every 2 years. And on the board sits 4 regional representatives, and the organization then is structured regionally: Atlantic region, Southern region, Midwest and Western region, and Canada constitutes a 5th segment of the organization. And
Yes.
we communicate with our member agencies through the regional representatives on the board. And we try to provide essentially training services, because we all recognize that in order to effectively combat discrimination in all of its ugly forms,
Yes.
personnel and commissioners must be trained in a very contemporary and a much more affirmative and systemic way. So we emphasize a training service to our agency membership. We also emphasize, of course, a clearinghouse function, that is the exchange of information and providing current data on issues and problems to all the other people is another major issue and a major service we try to provide. But, in a sense, the annual session, while it's coming together for 4 or 5 days of delegates and visitors and observers, it too constitutes a major effort to provide a forum for exchange
Yes.
of individuals. We benefit all so much from just knowing someone that's different in a setting like this week in Canada and Halifax. We get to know folks from Great Britain and other parts of the Canadian government, as well as our own country, and it's those informal associations that lends itself to growth and development. So we're really all about how to improve our own lot. How do we become more professional, more effective, more efficient at what we do? But the goal of all that, of course, is to do a better job at dealing with the problems of discrimination.
Well, I'd like to talk to you a minute about some of the objectives that IORA has set for itself in the next year. I had an opportunity before going on the air today to examine your 1982-83 action plan. Could you perhaps share with us some of the objectives, some of the priorities that IORA has set for itself over the next year?
That action plan is another example of an interest expressed by a member of our board in having the board develop a program, set of objectives and goals for itself. Each of us in our own way bring to the table, bring to the organization some particular skill or interest, and that's what makes the organization, again, unique. The action plan represents a statement of goals and objectives for the organization. It's a rather ambitious document. Underneath the document is a thought that we would have a staff, obviously. As you look at the goals and objectives, such as developing a strong public relations program nationally and internationally, developing a strong centralized clearinghouse. This was a major objective of the action plan. developing training programs and fundraising capability. These objectives and goals are really where we wish to be. And we recognize, on one hand, as a group of volunteers,
Yes.
we won't reach them immediately, but we need some targets for ourselves. And it gives the membership, on the other hand, an opportunity to hold its board of directors and its elected leadership accountable for moving the organization forward. The recommendation or the action plan in there dealing with relationships with our federal government is very critical.
Yes.
Because in the U.S., as we are relating now to a government at the federal level that speaks of deregulation and decentralization and less emphasis on the federal responsibility, more and more on the local and state,
Yes.
we at the local level now must develop a greater capability in addressing a new federalism, so-called. But we still feel and argue vigorously we must hold our own federal government accountable for certain basic constitutional civil rights and civil liberties. So that part of the action plan is a very vital one, which is essentially my responsibility, but obviously alone you can't do it well. So the action plan presupposes almost a staff, but we are committed nonetheless to take on pieces of it and carry it out.
Another one of the major responsibilities I see that you're going to be responsible for is in the whole area of fundraising. That's
Yes.
going to be quite an onerous
It is, particularly in these times throughout the world where you don't find private foundations and corporations and charities prepared to pick up the slack of our governments. There are less and less incentives to provide dollars and grants to governmental organizations in particular, probably more effort made to provide monies to non-governmental programs. The tax incentives that used to be in place are being threatened by our current economic and fiscal policies. Our
Yes.
own U.S. government discussing ways of rewriting the tax law, and I suspect making it less and less attractive for people to give money to organizations such as ours. So you're right, these represent difficult times in raising funds. Our dues structure, which each agency pays a dues to the organization, would net us no more than, say, $23,000 a year, and that will hardly provide any decent service, particularly when you must run an office out of Washington. The fundraising effort, though, perhaps can be enhanced if we could retain some, these are my current thoughts, retain some fundraiser, some professional fundraiser that,
Yes.
that would operate with us for with an understanding that he or she would then share in some percentage or some portion of whatever we would do. My point is that it's a full-time job,
right.
and my role will be probably to give it general direction and try to identify some sources and then see if we can get a full-time, part-time person in there to raise those funds professionally for us.
Right. I can't resist the temptation to comment at this stage that, or to commend you and the others in the association for the job that you're doing. It's when you look at the range of services and the impact that the IORA has had in this whole area of human rights, it's much to the credit of people like yourself who've offered so much volunteer time. It's amazing to think that you could have the impact that you've had without having the benefit of the, when one thinks of the, when we look at all of the delegates and so on, you think, it must take massive amount of staff time to do this kind of thing. So it's certainly to your credit and to the credit of others who donate so much volunteer time to make the thing work. One of the other areas that I wanted, before we move on, that I wanted to touch on in this whole action plan, I see that there's been some suggestion of new approaches for encouraging the membership of the smaller agencies. I gather that there's been some difficulty in the past with the smaller official human rights agencies becoming involved with the IORA.
Since 1949, the inception of the organization as a nonprofit corporation or a nonprofit organization, there's been some discord among us as to the benefits that could be obtained by the smaller local commissions in our organization, in the country, in Canada. The dues structure impacts adversely on the small agency. You take a portion of your annual budget from your legislature and you give it over to IORA. And if you have a small appropriation to start with, every dollar counts.
Yes.
Whereas the bigger state commissions like New York and Michigan and Pennsylvania, they are able to disperse $300, $400 very easily and not
Yes.
really feel it. Another problem of the due structure, the appearance of inequity or injustice, is that those of us that come from well-to-do states and well-to-do agencies, large or small, we are able to come to the annual meeting. And now, take next year, we're in Wichita, Kansas, in the U.S. At that annual meeting will be an election of officers, a new president and board members, regional representatives. And there is some honor attached to serving on the board, but only those persons that can come to the annual meeting, that can afford to travel, in other words, will get to the annual meeting. And then if you're at the annual meeting, you have a better chance of, participating, of course, and being elected to office. And those are leadership roles. That's where the problem surfaces with respect to the membership. That is the opportunity to serve on the board and to participate. That the smaller agencies do not enjoy that, because it's not a question of participating yearly, but rather really serving on the board is the issue.
Yes.
Far as benefiting from the year-to-year or day-to-day activities, we try to make whatever service we're providing available to all the agencies. That's not a real issue. The issue is that if you're a very tiny agency in West Kansas or West Michigan or North Dakota, and your governor or mayor has put travel restrictions on your budget, says you can't travel out of state, then you're not going to come to the annual meeting, obviously. If you're not there, then you don't have to come to participate. But you will benefit from some service that we might provide through the mail or bring it to your doorstep almost. We have revised and rethought our due structure to try to make it fairer. But on the other hand, there's some of us argue for an increase in the due structure too. That would really, I think, eliminate some people. But we have decided, for at least for the time being, to leave it as it is, and on the other hand, encourage and find ways in a creative manner of involving the smaller commissions. And we've done that rather successfully. We've put to rest somewhat of our internal problems about small versus large agencies.
Yes. Well, these are always problems
of any organization.
For any, particularly international organization like your own.
Right.
Well, I'd like to chat with you for just a few moments about the board, how it's composed, and the officers and so on. How are they chosen, selected, and what kinds of terms do they have?
Well, every 2 years, the membership at an annual meeting of the corporation will elect a president and a first and second vice president and a secretary and a treasurer. Those persons, and the immediate past president,
yes,
those persons constitutes an executive committee. Further, the board consists of 4 regional representatives, such as I'm one of the representatives for the Atlantic region, then it's the Midwest, Southern, and Western region, plus 4 at-large people. So the board consists of 4 at-large representatives, 4 regional representatives, and the officers, the president through the secretary and treasurer. The board is supposed to represent the organization both regionally and geographically and ethically, racially, religiously, sex. We try to encompass on the board then all of the what we call protected classes in our midst, so that there's a contribution from all perspectives made to policy. And the board is a policy-making body, like any other corporation. The difference being we don't have a staff to delegate the policy to. So we make policy, and then we delegate it to ourselves to carry out. That's one of our difficulties.
Yes.
But the board is a rather interesting group. It is the nucleus of the corporation. It does the day-to-day things. As we've discussed so far, I have several administrative responsibilities as a board member, and other board members carry on certain responsibilities. It is a job that's so vital that I think we perform it, even though it's difficult, because we care an awful lot about what we're doing.
Right. Well, now, I mentioned in the introduction to today's program that there were in the vicinity of 250 participants, and this conference has been held in Halifax. I've had the opportunity of attending some of the sessions, and it's a very good cross-section of people that are there. What goes into the decision about the location of having a meeting in a place like Halifax, for example? How did the conference come to be held in Halifax? I understand this is only the second time that in the history of IORA that you've had your conference in Canada.
About 15 years ago in Toronto, Ontario. 2 basic criteria entertained. One, we need a host agency, and a host agency that's prepared to contribute and make a contribution the way Dr. McCurdy's agency, his commission and staff has, and the other officials of this province. And that's vital, that you have an organization prepared to not only contribute time and resources, but also staff, for example, and ideas and suggestions for program content. You need a host agency that's going to try to make the delegates comfortable. You know, there ought to be some social recreation attached to a conference of this sort. Although the primary reason being for the conference is a learning experience and professional growth, but nonetheless, we must also have some recreation. So you need a host that can do those things. You need a host that's strongly committed to making the conference successful. But we always don't have a host that way, like that is. And sometimes we will end up in a place where we don't have that kind of host. We try to put the conference in different parts of the country or different parts of Canada, but it will depend basically upon whether or not you have an adequate host. We want to spread it around. We don't always want to be in the West Coast or the East Coast or the South or the North. Next year we'll be in Wichita. Last year we were in Dayton, Ohio. Year before that in Denver, Colorado. And we've been all over the country. We think the spread of the conference enables local and state agencies, though, to grow also. I'm sure Dr. Hill's agency here and Dan Hill's agency in Ontario, when we were there last, benefited greatly from the exposure it received from having all of us here. And the growth and development of those agencies, I'm sure, will be attributable to our being here and present. So we're doing a number of things with wherever we put the conference.
Right. Well, I had the opportunity of participating in a very, very helpful workshop on one day during the conference. That was the workshop relating to the emergence of hate groups and some discussion of processes in terms of dealing with these groups. And I'd like to just perhaps turn to a discussion of that in the remaining minutes that we have left in today's program. I was startled to learn that there seems to be an increase in the number of incidents of violence and difficulties that are being caused in the United States by groups who are causing difficulties as a result of racial considerations, religious considerations, or whatever. I'd like to have you comment a little bit on that situation. I know you've been very, very active, and I was very much impressed with some of the things that your agency in Connecticut is doing in terms of dealing with the situation. I wonder if perhaps I could ask you, first of all, to give us some kind of an overview of what the situation is like, and then perhaps turn to some discussion of what you've been doing to deal with some of the problems that have come up.
I think the social economic problem, and that's what it is in a sense, a social economic problem, arises out of a conservative and a status quo approach to resolving social issues. That is to say, there is a racial and ethnic backlash in our society that goes something like this: that there's a perception that minority people have gone too far in attainment of basic civil rights. There's a reaction against affirmative action, in that affirmative action is seen by some people as taken away from the majority to give to the minority, whatever that minority might be. That feeling among the populace is further exacerbated by politicians, in my view, that exploit those feelings. So the politician that will observe that some people feel strongly about affirmative action or civil rights will exploit that and come into office. And that's what happens. That's what has happened in the United States. Our federal establishment is largely representative of a view that civil rights progress must be slowed down because it's taken away from the majority. And my comment is that hate groups then use that as a foundation. Hate groups find great consolation and great solace in the fact that it has a political structure and an economic set of policies that reinforce their view. So whether the administration says it's their fault or not, the fact is the hate groups like the Klan and the John Birch Society and neo-Nazis and all kinds of anti-groups surface and do well, by the way, in these times because it perceives a government in place that's supportive of their position, whether intentionally or not. And it's a very serious problem, therefore, when one perceives the government as being part of the hate syndrome.
Yes.
Now, perceptions are important, and I say that because I'm sure governments will say, well, we aren't supportive of hate groups, but they are by their failure to do certain things. The failure to speak out against anti-black, anti-women, anti-Chicano, anti-Native American progress, attacks on such progress reinforces the hate group. What we in Connecticut and other parts of the country have done is to recognize that merely passing laws do not address the problem properly, because you have basic constitutional guarantees of free speech to contend with when you attempt to address hate groups. In terms of assembly and their utterances, these things seem to be protected by the Constitution, and therefore we must turn to different kinds of ways of addressing the problem, such as trying to re-educate our school children, our students and teachers, and trying to re-educate the general population as to the value of difference, the value of learning about things that are not like ourselves. And we have so long neglected to teach about difference. We teach that somehow we're all in a big melting pot and it makes no difference. Well, that's not really true. We are different, all of us, and those differences are to be cherished and valued and promoted. And teachers ought to be teaching about how important it is to know about people that are not like ourselves. And teachers resist that, by the way. Educators resist that. We are trying to, in our state also, trying to cause our public officials, including our governor, to become more affirmative in their dealings with these problems, as opposed to sitting back hoping they'll go away. I'm afraid that is a common tendency, is to pretend it's there, but maybe it'll go away if I don't say anything about it. We are aggressively pursuing media efforts to change attitudes. We know that attitudes are essential with respect to behavior. So we are about the business, which is a very difficult and long-range effort, obviously. It'll take us a lifetime, many lifetimes, I'm sure, to see some tangible result. But it is the only way to go. And I feel encouraged, though, that at least our government in Connecticut has begun to address the problem with our agency support.
Well, Art, I want to thank you. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and I'm getting the indication that our time for today is gone. I want to, in closing, thank you for being our guest on Black Horizons. Wish you the best of luck and good health in terms of all of the tasks that I know you're going to be busy with in terms of your participation as a board member with IORA. And I want to also give you our best wishes for your very, very good work that I know that you're doing in terms of the Connecticut Commission. We want to thank you for being our guest. We want to thank you for watching our program and invite you back next week. Thank you for watching.